Hello, and welcome to A Week in Watches, episode 21. Week in Watches is a weekly look back at watch news, stories, and reviews. I'm your host, Zach Weiss. Thanks for joining me. This week we have a handful of stories, but with a lot of watches within those stories. We have some independent stuff, and then we have some big Swiss stuff, and some cool collaborations as well. I think it's going to be a fun week. This week's sponsor is About Vintage, a Copenhagen, Denmark-based watch company. Their designs mix a flair for contemporary design with an appreciation for history and tradition. Learn more about their 1960 racing chronographs later in this episode. All right, our first story. Massena stakes his independence. So we actually recently featured another Massena Lab project a few weeks ago when he teamed up with Habring 2 to release a perpetual calendar mono pusher that, despite being an incredibly rare combination of complications, was relatively affordable for what you were getting at around the 20K mark. It was a really beautiful watch, honestly kind of obsessed with it, and I actually had the opportunity to see it in person a few weeks ago, and honestly it was even better than I expected. It was just this beautiful little watch, fit really well. So this week they announced a new watch, and it's a limited edition as well, but it's a larger production than that last watch, and a more affordable watch, though still a little pricey. And it kind of takes the brand into a new, more like independent brand space. Not that they weren't independent before, but this sort of is it's a different style of watch. It's more of a series of watches. So they're sort of following this like new trend of watchmaking, which I think is really exciting, which is where you see some higher brands that typically work at a higher price range, particularly like independent brands working together with other people to create something a bit more affordable, therefore bringing some aspect of that sort of high-end independent space. Louis Erard working with Vianney Halter comes to mind, things of that nature. William Massena of Massena Labs teamed up with Swiss watchmaker Raoul Paget, I believe his name is pronounced. I apologize if I got that wrong. It's spelt like pages, though, if you want to look him up. He's a truly independent Swiss watchmaker, a one-man shop. I believe he was trained, worked at Patek and some other brands before going out on his own. He makes his whole watches by hand in his shop on his own, which is, just kind of a completely insane level of craft. Together, they've produced a watch called the Margraf, which is a 38.5 millimeter sector dial. It's inspired by a watch from the 1930s with a sort of a similar look to it. And it's an interesting sector dial because it feels a little bit more minimalist than other sector dials. It's quite restrained, just uses white and silver and some crosshairs. There's numerals on it, but just around the minute track, no larger numerals. And it's completely flat too. The Margraf version, this new version, they also added a sub-seconds dial at 6 with its own little crosshair. It's very nice looking. So the top side is sort of simple and understated, but when you flip the watch over, you get sort of a different story, and this is really where you see the independent watchmaker at play. It features a movement called the M660, which is a sort of a bespoke movement for the Massena Labs, designed by Raoul Paget, and manufactured by a partner. They're not at the point yet where they're manufacturing their own movements, but they now have their own bespoke movement, which is, like I said, kind of a huge leap into this independent space behind the Massena Lab brand. It's a gorgeous manual wound movement with very high-end finishing on it. So there's hand chamfered bridges and plates. There's some really fine Côte de Genève on there, some really beautiful perlage. Underneath the balance wheel is actually the silhouette of a turtle, which is the signature of Raoul Paget. It's also been highly regulated and adjusted for accuracy, which is shown on the back that it's regulated to like 6 positions and different temperature variations, things like that. So it's just this beautiful high-end movement in a very understated watch. There'll be 99 units of the Margraf sort of coming out staggered over the course of a couple years because they can't produce them all at once. And they're priced at $8,675. So that, just really brings this sort of element of higher end independent watchmaking into a more affordable price point, obviously not an inexpensive price point, but, sub 10K for this style of watchmaking is really quite exceptional and a very cool place to see Massena Lab going. Next up, Rowing Blazers and Eric Wind launch another series of Seiko 5s. So the first round of Rowing Blazers x Eric Wind from Wind Vintage x Seiko 5s, a triple collab, a rare triple collab, if you will, went very fast. They came out last year and they mixed Rowing Blazers' sort of preppy but quirky fashion sensibilities with Eric Wynn's knowledge of vintage Seiko references, and then of course Seiko 5's easy to love affordable watches. So it's a winning mix. They were colorful and fun, and they stood out, and therefore they did very, very well. So for 2022, they took a similar approach, but made a different series of watches. These were inspired by Rowing Blazers founder Jack Carlson's own vintage Seiko watch, which was a reference 6106-7107. This is a little quirky 70-meter sport diver. Doesn't have an external bezel. I've actually never seen one of these in person. It potentially has an internal rotating bezel, but I'm hesitant to say that with confidence because, like I said, I haven't handled it. And it just had this like fun 70s look to it, a bright orange dial, chunky markers, things like that. It's you know, it's classic quirky Seiko. So they designed this new quartet of Seiko 5s based on the Dress KX models, so the smaller bezel-less models, around that watch. So on the new ones, you'll find a chapter ring that is sort of taken from that 6106 model. Applied markers quite significantly that are taken from that, which are fairly large and chunky. One of the more interesting aspects that they took, and that actually took me a second to notice this, is that the date window has been framed a little bit differently. So rather than just a square, it actually kind of like goes up and out. So it's like a sort of a diamond sort of a shape, very subtle, but that was taken from there. So it's a nice little design cue that overall kind of gives the watches a little bit more of a funky 70s feel. So there's 4 watches, as I said. 3 of them feature singularly colored bright dials. So there's like a neon orange, which is taken from the original watch, but then also an extremely bright green and a really bright blue. Those colors, like when I was looking at them, they immediately brought to mind those sunglasses you got in party bags as a kid, you know, with the black frame and the neon sides. It's like that kind of color. So, you know, a little bit like ironic, perhaps. The last one is a little bit more sort of in the flavor, I would say, of Rowing Blazers outfit. So this one is a black dial, and the applied markers have been painted different colors, kind of giving them the look of naval flags going around the dial. So, you know, it brings in this immediate preppiness, but also this playful sense of color. I believe that one actually might have sold out already, so I apologize in advance. All of the watches come on bracelets, but with an additional nylon strap, typically in a bright or contrasting color to the dial. These are not subtle watches at all, and they embrace that certainly. They retail for $495 and are available from Rowing Blazers, Seiko, and I believe other select retailers. I'll add an asterisk to that. The one that was sold out on Rowing Blazers, so perhaps elsewhere you can find it. And now, a word from our sponsor, About Vintage. The About Vintage 1960 racing chronographs combine style cues from classic cars and classic watches with a Bauhaus sensibility. External tachometers and a 369 sub-dial layout gives them the look of mid-century chronographs, while clean lines and restrained typefaces add a modern flair. Measuring 40mm by 47.5mm by 12.7mm, these Miyota quartz-powered chronos are capable of timing down to 1/10 of a second, making them perfect for timing laps. Available in midnight blue and off-white with black subdials, the 1960 racing chronographs have a starting price of $399 on leather. However, there are various options, including bracelets and rubber straps as well. The 1960 racing chronographs are currently available for pre-order through November 6th, 2022 at 20% off retail at aboutvintage.com. And now it's time for the release of the week. Omega rings the watch world's bell, not once, but twice. Brace yourselves, this is a big one. So I'd say it's pretty rare, I find, for a major Swiss watch brand to like really wow everyone. You know, they tend to do what they do and do it well. They make, you know, in the case of Omega, iconic watches, classic watches that are very popular, you know, are purchased quite frequently by collectors and non-collectors alike. They have a nice technical thread in Omega as well, which can be seen in their, you know, the coaxial escapement that they've put in their watches, which was, you know, originally created by George Daniels. It's, you know, considered to be an improvement on the Swiss lever escapement. They've been a force in the, you know, use of silicone technology in their movements, which has led them to really high ratings of anti-magnetism. They have helped them create the master coaxial or master chronometer designations. which has just led to like these really tough, accurate watches. So, you know, when you buy a $5,000 Omega Seamaster Max or Master Coaxial, you're frankly getting a really, you know, a hell of a good watch at that point with a lot of cool tech in it. But they don't do like crazy high-end complications like the Pateks and Vacherons of the world. Like, you know, they don't do really perpetual calendars very often. They don't do tourbillons very often. They don't do sonneries very often. They occasionally do calendars and occasionally do tourbillons, but sonneries in particular is quite rare for them. But this week, they changed that in a really, really big way. So Omega introduced not one, but two watches, the Olympic 1932 and Speedmaster Chrono Chimes. Chrono Chime. These are built around an incredible and exotic new caliber, just called the Calibre 1932. It's the most complicated movement Omega has ever made. It's an industry first, and it's one hell of a thing. So I'm going to rattle off what this movement does here and just brace yourself. It's a split-second integrated mono-pusher high beat, says 5 hertz or 36,000 beats per hour chronograph, with a minute repeater that doesn't chime the time, but rather chimes the elapsed time from the chronograph. Mind blown. There's more. It's got a 60-hour power reserve, which doesn't suck, particularly considering everything else I just read off. And it's also a coaxial master chronometer. This is just like a completely and utterly insane movement. And just to go back to what it actually does, you start the chronograph, you stop it after a few minutes, you hit the sonnerie button, and it'll chime what it reads out on the dial. So not the time, but the chronograph elapsed time. That's, I believe no one's ever done that before. They're certainly making that claim, at least in a wristwatch of this size. And it's insane and totally exotic and just completely mind-blowing. It was co-developed with Blancpain, which is interesting. Makes me wonder if we're going to see it again sometime soon. And took 6 years of R&D. Has 17 patents, and the movement itself is built with no less than 46.44 grams of Sedna gold. So 46.44 grams is like as heavy as like a light titanium watch, and that's just the gold that's in the movement. So the movement itself probably weighs more, and the whole watch that it's in weighs even more than that. Like I said, it's a work of art. It's completely insane. If I were to be very picky, though, very picky, and this is a ridiculous place to be picky, it only counts up to 15 minutes, which I think is curious, and I wonder if there's like a technical limitation or reason for that. So the Calibre 1932, as I said before, is in two watches. The first is the Olympic 1932 Chrono Chime. This one looks like a pocket watch. It's an homage, actually, to a Omega Minute Repeater pocket watch from 1892. So it's this very traditional, you know, pre-watch, frankly, look to it. Like it's a pocket watch that's been converted into a watch, and you can see from how the strap attaches, you know, how that would have worked. It's actually quite beautiful. It's 45 millimeters. Features a crown at top with a pusher, and then a stopwatch style pusher at 11. So once again, these are mono pusher split-second chronographs on top of everything else. It features a enamel dial with guilloche 925 silver elements around the bezel and subdials. And what's really cool is that the pattern of that guilloche, which might at glance look like a traditional pattern that you'd see, you know, on a brand like Breguet's watches or something, is actually a graphic representation of the sound wave created by this watch. It's a completely gorgeous watch, and it's certainly one that is befitting of celebrating this type of movement. Also, on the dial side, you can see the hammers and where they hit the gongs, of course. But surprise, this is Omega. They also put it in a Speedmaster. Why not? Why not make another Speedmaster that's like the most covetable Speedmaster now ever made? It's also by far the most complicated Speedmaster ever made, I think. I would assume so. This one's 45 millimeters also. It's made out of Sedna gold. It's a straight lug speedy. It features an enameled aventurine dial with guilloche gold elements. So the 925 silver elements from the white dial pocket watch version are here in done in rose gold, but the same sort of sound wave pattern. And the aventurine dial, which is aventurine enamel, I'm not quite sure exactly what that means, but aventurine is typically a glass, and it features kind of like metallic powder throughout it, giving it this beautiful spacey sparkle effect. And that is seen on the dial, but then also the bezel insert. I'm a sucker for aventurine. It's really beautiful. It definitely gives it a spacey sort of decadence to it. With that said, though, I imagine this is more of a land-based Speedmaster, as there is no sound in a vacuum in space. Makes you think, doesn't it? It's also 17 millimeters thick, which I've seen some people kind of mentioning. But honestly, if you care about that, you're paying attention to the wrong things with this watch. I don't even know if this is a watch anyone would wear. You just own it. So now back to the beginning when I said these watches are available. They are available, but rather than being like one-off or concept pieces, they're just going to live in a museum kind of a thing. Quantities are TBD. I haven't seen it written out anywhere. And the price is, well, befitting of a split-second high-beat master coaxial monopusher Chiming chronograph, which is to say around $450,000. But both watches also come with a walnut resonance box chamber thing that you can put the watch on so it sounds louder, which is just, it's a great value add at $450,000. Regardless, absolutely incredible watchmaking here. This is like the kind of thing that I just find it's super exciting and geeky in all the right ways. And, it's very cool, like I said, to see a brand like Omega do something like this on occasion. Like I said, you kind of associate them with just watches you go and buy. But it's nice to know that they can pursue this sort of high-level, highfalutin type of watchmaking as well. And that's it for episode 21 of A Week in Watches. I'd like to thank our sponsor, About Vintage. Please go check them out. If you liked this episode, please do like and subscribe to our channel. And for daily news reviews, head to wornandwound.com. Thank you.